On behalf of Asia Society Northern California and Seattle, welcome to our event on Shifting Landscapes, the Changing Face of Reporting on China. We'll hear from a talented lineup of journalist speakers who have spent years in China, and we're going to hear their insights from on the ground. This event is part 8 of our Seeking Truth, part 2 of our 8-part Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S.-China program series, and it supports our mission at Asia Society, which is to navigate shared futures. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of our Northern California and Seattle Centers. For our format, first, we're going to hear a presentation from Mary Kay Magistad, the Deputy Director of Asia Society's Center on U.S.-China Relations, who has a report out on this very topic called Fair Game. Then we'll have a panel discussion with 4 top-notch journalists Mary Kay will moderate. All of our speaker bios are on our Northern California and Seattle websites, and there will be time for Q&A at the end from the audience. If you have a question, type it in the Q&A box, and Mary Kay will be monitoring them throughout the program. Get those questions in early. This event is on the record. We are recording, and the video will be posted on our websites. We have until 6 p.m. Pacific for this discussion. A few more words about Mary Kay to get us started. On top of what she does at Asia Society, she is an award-winning journalist who lived and reported in East Asia for more than 2 decades for NPR, PRI's BBC The World, and many more. She has 2 podcasts and has taught audio journalism at Berkeley as well. Mary Kay, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Margaret. It's really a pleasure and an honor as ever to be able to moderate an event with you. I'm going to start with something that I think many of us, if not most of us, can agree on. The story of China's rise, of everything that's been happening in China, the way that China's been affecting the world over time, is one of the epic stories of our time. It's one of the stories that 100 years from now, people will still be studying and thinking about. And reporting in China as a foreign journalist is usually interesting, no matter what's happening, even if it's not always easy. I was based in China, based in Beijing for 15 years. And for some of that time for much of that time was involved with the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, helping to monitor reporting conditions for foreign correspondents. And it was from that background that I helped the International Federation of Journalists a couple of years ago with its report Fair Game, which was looking at the state of reporting conditions at that time going into the Winter Olympics in China. And, there were a lot of interviews I did. I spent an hour and a half with each of about 20 journalists from 9 different countries with different levels of experience reporting in China from different media. They shared something in common, which was that they felt that things had shifted significantly and for the worse over the course of the previous year or 2 that they'd been reporting in China. And it really got in the way of their being able to report comprehensively on a range of issues, as many of us had been able to do for many years before that. I was lucky enough in the 15 years I was in China, while it wasn't always smooth sailing, it was generally possible to report on a very wide range of issues throughout the country. I reported in every province. Most journalists I know, or at least many I know, did the same thing in the countryside, in small towns, in cities. So that report, but also the work that the Foreign Correspondents Club does with its annual surveys, looks at, okay, how well is all of this going? And what I'm going to do very briefly here is just walk you through sort of a mashup of some of what I got from my conversations with journalists who are reporting in China now, what the FCC, Foreign Correspondents Club of China, surveys have shown, including the most recent survey, the one that just came out this year, and compare that to the one from last year. And then we're going to go to our incredibly experienced panelists, who I'll introduce on the other end of just kind of setting this up for you. So sometimes reporting in China have been easier than others, and even within a given period of time, politically sensitive anniversaries or events tend to bring out additional layers of security and scrutiny regarding foreign correspondents and their sources. Once the politically sensitive anniversary or event is over, things have tended to ease up again. That was a familiar rhythm throughout the late 90s and the first years of the 2000s when I was in China. Over this past decade, under Xi Jinping's leadership, there's been a somewhat different rhythm. There's been more distrust toward foreign journalists, more restrictions, more surveillance. and more denial of access. And for most, or at least many foreign journalists, especially for foreign journalists over the last 3 or 4 years, certainly more than at any time that I was aware of since I started reporting in China in 95. So why was that? Well, Xi Jinping has told China's domestic journalists that their job is to be the mouthpiece of China's Communist Party, or the CCP. He and the CCP would also like foreign journalists to just tell the stories the party wants told, or at least not tell the stories that the party doesn't want told. Beyond that, US-China tensions in recent years certainly haven't helped. After the Chinese government revoked the press credentials of 3 Wall Street Journal correspondents in early 2020, the Trump administration retaliated by limiting the number of journalists China's 5 major state-owned media could have in the United States, so reduced the number by about 40%, from 160 to 100. The Chinese government then retaliated itself and kicked out journalists from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and select other US outlets. That left about 39 US journalists in China by the count of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China. So in the FCC survey that came out most recently in March of this year, there are 166 members of the FCC now. At its peak, the FCC had more than 400 members. That was around the time of the Olympics. 102 people responded, and these were journalists working for media in 30 different countries. Of those who responded, 100% said China was not meeting international standards for press freedoms and reporting. More than half said they were obstructed or harassed at least once by police or other officials while reporting, down slightly from the previous year. Stephen McDonnell from the BBC said his team was regularly followed by carloads of officials when they reported outside of Beijing, with the officials harassing both the BBC journalists and trying to intimidate their sources. 38 of respondents to this survey said at least one of their sources had been harassed or detained for interacting with foreign journalists, up from 25% in 2021. That's 25 to 38, a pretty significant jump. Chinese social media and state-run media have made slurs and attacks on foreign journalists, verbal attacks, and especially interestingly on female, on female reporters of Chinese or East Asian heritage. Those were down in 2022 compared to 2021, but they hadn't disappeared. And over time, these have included sexual slurs and even a death threat or two. Also in this survey in 2022, the one that came out, was done in 2022, came out early this year, 57% of journalists said they had been visibly followed over the course of the previous year. Half said authorities had disrupted their interviews. 18% said they were detained at least once in the course of reporting that year. 14% said they were manhandled or subjected to physical force while reporting, up slightly from the previous year. 1 in 4 said they had been delayed or harassed when entering mainland China at immigration, often pulled aside and interrogated about their reporting. And almost 1 in 10 were told their residence permits that allowed them to stay and report in China might not be renewed in the future due to their critical reporting. Besides all of this, foreign journalists said in the last 2 years of FCC surveys that sources are now more wary than in the past about talking with foreign reporters, following campaigns by China's state-run media and social media telling people to be careful because foreign journalists might be spies or might be trying to write something that will harm China. In 2021, even many Chinese academics and think tank specialists who had often talked to foreign journalists in the past often said no, because they saw no upside for themselves in doing it and plenty of potential downside. So some of this isn't new. Some is new only in degree. Some was common in an earlier time in China and then became less common, and now it's showing up again. One thing that is new is the enhanced surveillance capability that's possible with 200 million security cameras throughout China, with mobile phones telling the authorities where a given journalist is, and with the all-in-one WeChat app that's a treasure trove of personal data for the government about anyone, not just journalists. You know, you have your messages, contacts, cab rides, bank account information, medical and shopping information. And then there was also the COVID app that was ostensibly meant to help alert people when someone around them had COVID and when they needed to isolate, but which also allowed the government to track movements and thus was another intrusive mode of surveillance. So you might wonder, with all this, how do foreign journalists manage to do much of anything in China? That's what we're here to talk about, with a panel of 3 seasoned China correspondents who have managed to do a wide range of stories, from leadership politics to personal portraits. We're going to talk with them about their work, and I'll introduce them to you now. Melinda Liu is Beijing bureau chief for Newsweek magazine. She also writes regularly for Foreign Policy. She has lived and reported in Beijing since 1998. This is her second stretch in China. The first was almost 3 years in the early 1980s, when she opened Newsweek's first Beijing bureau. And even before that, she was China economy correspondent at the Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong in the late 70s, covering the beginnings of economic reform in China. Melinda was also Newsweek's Hong Kong-based Asia regional editor, 1983 to 92, and a diplomatic correspondent for 6 years after that, reporting on the State Department, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the fall of the Taliban, the first Persian Gulf War, and U.S. military interventions in Somalia and Haiti. She also shared in a Newsweek award, an award Newsweek won for its coverage of the fall of Saddam Hussein. Melinda also won the 2006 Shorenstein Journalism Award in recognition of her reporting on Asia. Ann Scott Tyson also started reporting in China in the 1980s. She was there from 1987 to 1992 for the Christian Science Monitor. She then co-authored the book Chinese Awakenings: Life Stories from the Unofficial China. She's now once again based in Beijing as the Monitor's China and Northeast Asia correspondent, having moved there in late 2021 after having to wait a while for her visa, and we'll hear more about that when we're chatting. Like Melinda, Ann began her China-focused reporting in Hong Kong, in her case for UPI in the mid-'80s. In between her 2 stints in China, Ann spent a decade covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also covered beats including the Pentagon, Congress, and the Midwest. Besides the Monitor, she has also been a staff reporter for the Washington Post and has contributed to the Wall Street Journal. And finally, John Ruwitch is an NPR China correspondent. He started with NPR in 2020, but because of COVID, as well as US-China tensions over journalist visas, he has been based in China only over the past year. And we'll hear more about why his visa took a while as well. Before COVID, John spent more than 19 years with Reuters in Asia, the last 8 of which were in Shanghai. There he first covered a broad beat that took him to the China-North Korea border and the edge of the South China Sea, among other places. He later led a team that covered China's business and financial markets. John has also had postings in Hanoi, Hong Kong, and Beijing. He has reported on anti-corruption campaigns, elite Communist Party politics, labor disputes, human rights issues, currency devaluations, earthquakes, and more. John speaks Mandarin and Vietnamese. And John, I'm going to stay with you. You did have to wait for your visa for a while. Why was that? How did that go?
It was part luck, part politics. I switched jobs from Reuters over to NPR at the beginning of 2020. We actually applied for the visa in December of 2019. The pandemic hit and slowed things down. And then, of course, in the summer of 2020, U.S.-China relations tanked and all visas were held up. So I wasn't able to get back in until roughly a year ago, a year plus a little bit. And since then, I've been basically splitting time between the U.S. and China, going in and out. So it was pandemic and politics that held us up.
And you've been busy since you've been spending more of your time in China. You filed something like 36 stories on a wide range of topics. Again, leadership, politics, the disappearance of China's foreign minister, Qin Gang, youth unemployment, a woman who finds out when police show up to arrest her computer geek husband that he's been a prominent political blogger for years.
Right.
Have you gotten any pushback? How has it been reporting these? Has it been smooth sailing?
It's funny, listening to you describe the FCC survey, I was nodding my head thinking, yep, that's happened to me, but none of that has happened to me, I have to say, in the past year that I've been reporting in China. Maybe it's just dumb luck, except for lining up interviews with folks who then backed out of them, right? Because they maybe came under pressure or realized that they were talking to foreign media and probably shouldn't. It feels like it feels like there's some luck involved, and I don't know what to say other than I haven't encountered that pushback. There've been things in China that feel very different over these past few years after being away for 2.5 years and then getting back in. One of them, which you touched on, is the ubiquity of technology, which is kind of a double-edged sword for us as reporters there. It makes booking trains, planes, automobiles, mobikes, you name it, 10 times easier than it was back in the day when we overlapped in China. It's a double-edged sword, though, right? I mean, it's you are forever and always on somebody's radar there, or able to be on somebody's radar, put it that way. Ticketless travel, for instance, on trains means your passport is what you use to get onto a train these days, and it's that much. There's that much shorter a distance between you and those that can monitor you. If that's kind of a very elegant way of putting it, but that's one of the things that stood out. I've also seen, and I'd be interested in Melinda and Anne's view on this. It seems like pandemic controls that have mostly been rolled back are still in place in some areas. I tried to get onto a university campus a couple of months ago, and they have a quota for non-students and non-professors getting onto campus, and you have to use WeChat to scan a code to register to get onto the campus. So there's no walking onto campuses, talking with students, talking with professors, that type of thing.
Yeah. Anne, over to you. You also had to wait a while for your visa. What happened in your case?
Yeah, I had to wait 3 years. I think I was waiting the longest. And it started out, I applied, and the initial part of the delay, I don't really know what caused it. I applied in early 2019. Then the media war between the US and China happened, and things just sort of snowballed and got worse and worse. And of course, COVID shut things down as well. I got my visa as the result of a diplomatic agreement between the US and China in November 2021, when pain was being felt by journalists on both sides. I mean, there were Chinese media in the US who were on very short-term visas. And so there had been sort of a reciprocity imposed, and that in a way was helpful. I think they both realized that this was not going to work out well. So they agreed. And as a result of that, I think I may have been the first of like 9 American journalists who got in. And American journalists at that time were also only getting residence permits for 3 years instead of the normal 1 year. But several months later, after the US solved something on its
for three months, or yeah. It's sometimes as short as 1 month, right?
Yeah.
You really wanted to harass someone?
Yeah. And then there was a further carrying out of that agreement, which allowed me to get a 1 year residence permit, which is more the norm. So I feel like I did wait for an incredibly long amount of time, but both sides did at least initially honor this agreement. And that was one small positive thing that happened.
Yeah. So now you've been back and you've been getting out in the field and reporting. It was almost 3 decades after you had left China when you came back. What struck you the most in terms of, let's stick with reporting conditions.
Okay.
Did anything stand out to you as being better, worse, more or less the same, remarkably, or?
Well, actually, I mean, I very first went to China as a reporter in 1983, and I was there for UPI from 83 to like 86. And at that time, I mean, China was just barely coming out of the Cultural Revolution. Reforms were starting, and communes were still being dismantled. I mean, there was very little private enterprise, no stock market, and there was this atmosphere of enthusiasm and excitement and curiosity. China had also been closed off during the Cultural Revolution. And so at that time, I think foreign journalists were sort of a conduit for information. People were really excited and eager to talk and share their stories. And I even had people confide to me about what they had been through during the Cultural Revolution, because there was a lot of internal mistrust among Chinese because there had been so much betrayal going on in their own society. And then now, I mean, now well, at that time, I mean, I was really able to interview widely local officials, senior officials. I mean, we would go to press conferences and the top leaders of the country would be right there. I handed Zhao Ziyang a letter requesting an interview at one point. He was the Communist Party leader at that time.
Wow.
And again, everyone from scholars to ordinary people were very, very eager to talk. Relations with the US were good. And so there was a lot of admiration for the US, a lot of seeking to emulate the US.
And
today,
fast forward.
yeah, most of those things have turned around. I mean, the reforms have definitely stalled out. China is very national security focused. It's sort of more inward looking in a way. During COVID, of course, it was essentially closed off for 3 years. Relations with the US have deteriorated. But I will say, nonetheless, I think since the COVID controls have been lifted, I think there's opportunity there. We can now travel around the country again, and I've just been starting to do this. I had a very, very successful trip to northern Shanxi province, spent time in villages, was uninhibited. I will say at the initial part of that trip, I was intensively followed by authorities and interfered with. It may have had to do with the fact that Xi Jinping was in this province at the same time, but that sort of faded away, and I was able to really re-explore rural life in China in a way that was very helpful to me and for my reporting. So the one thing I would simply add is that ordinary Chinese have been incredibly warm and welcoming, and I've experienced almost zero hostility. And when people find out that I'm an American, most of the time they say, well, you know, our governments have their issues, but that's not going to impact us. So that side of it is really nice.
Great. Melinda, does this sound familiar to you? I mean, you've had your arc of experience in China that goes way back to the 70s, but you've been in China all the way through since the late 90s. So like, what have you seen that in terms of reporting conditions now that to you feels familiar, feels fundamentally different, qualitatively different?
Okay, well, I think what feels very familiar is at the risk of sounding like I'm totally exaggerating, but or maybe I'm just personalizing it too much, but I get a sense that a lot of people I meet are exhibiting symptoms or actually saying things that make me think we're all in a somewhat of a post-traumatic stress syndrome situation. And of course, that was also true after 1989, the bloodshed and the protests focused on Tiananmen Square. The difference between now and 1989, of course, and it is quite different, is that back then it was a sharp, visible trauma that was hard to ignore. You know, it was hard to just paper it over with a sort of enforced amnesia and say, oh, nothing happened. Of course, people did say that, and the government did try to maintain that. But I mean, for a lot of ordinary people, they saw the visceral evidence in front of their very eyes. The other thing is that that was a relatively local situation. Yes, there were protests in many cities, but not the sense of blood, death, horror, terror, injury that those of us in Beijing saw. Okay, so fast forward to 2023. This is a nationwide trauma. I haven't spoken to anybody in China who hasn't been touched by COVID-19. And of course, that's not a man-made thing. I mean, well, we don't know where it came from, but it's not, the pandemic itself was not a result of a government policy somewhere. But the response to COVID-19 I think is what's caused the post-traumatic stress syndrome. It was so draconian, so heavy-handed, so frustrating, and indeed traumatic to those who lost loved ones, and it was felt across the country. Especially if they're elderly, your parents, you feel that in a way that is much more intense than if it's something that you heard about from someone else that didn't touch you at home.
So does that make people more willing and wanting to talk to you about their experience? Or
weirdly, I think it's created a phenomenon of people finding solidarity with other people who have who feel that they've been through a trauma. Okay, very few Chinese will say, "Oh, I think I have post-traumatic stress syndrome," because of course, anything psychiatric is a bit of a embryonic study or area of research right now. But I mean, a lot of people, even strangers, if you talk to them just casually for long enough a time, they might start saying, what was it like in other countries? Or, was it really this or that? Or did you lose anybody? Or did your parents, that sort of thing, even total strangers. Okay. Mm. The other thing that's very different is, as you yourself pointed out, the Big Brother is a lot bigger now. In the 80s and even in the 90s, even at the turn of the 2000s, and I count myself among these people, there was an expectation that technology would set us free, that would unify us, break down borders. The internet makes it allowable, for anybody to talk to anybody. And we thought that was, a breathtaking and game-changing event. Of course, it was a game-changing event. But our miscalculation was to think that technology had some kind of value system embedded in it, that it was an automatic agent for good values. And that was not the case. Technology is a tool, and anyone can use that tool. You can use it for good, but you can also use it for evil. And so what's happened now is almost a bureaucratization of the government response to journalists and also to its own people. The fact that it's omnipresent, everything you do, everywhere you go, everyone you see, everything you say, social media platform, it's all, even just the idea that it's all on record somewhere, I think is quite inhibiting.
So how does that affect your reporting?
Yeah, well, the way it's affected me, and I can only speak to myself, is that I'm, in the old days, we all, maybe naively, we all felt that information was somehow more valuable or more useful if you could attach a name to it, a real name. And then if you couldn't, then maybe you'd make up a name or you create a description or something like that. But for many of us, we were trained to, if you could, quote people by name. I think I've just kind of let that go. I just don't want to do that anymore, because for the same reason that I've let it go. I don't want to get into too much detail of the things that I've seen to people that I have spoken to, but I just I don't think the risk is worth it at this time. And so, of course, that makes a lot of things quite difficult. If you're trying to get to the bottom of what happened to Qin Gang, the foreign minister who disappeared and was removed from his post, all you're going to hear are individuals saying, well, I heard this and I heard that. And, of course, they don't want to be named. And of course, it's just speculation. So it makes things very difficult.
John, how about you? How has the new surveillance and security atmosphere in China, superstructure in China, affected your reporting, if at all?
I think on the technology piece that we were just talking about, there is a plus side. So as journalists working in this environment, we're always sort of finding a way in. We were talking about this earlier. There's always a cracked window to sneak in, right? There's always a way, or a way to do a version of what you originally set out to do. We can put it that way. The internet has been indispensable. These social media that's clearly monitored, is where we find a lot of the people we talk to. You know, if there's a bank run somewhere, that's the first place we turn to look for folks who are unhappy about the way the bank dealt with their money. The whole Urumqi fire protest spread that way. The A4 revolution with air quotes around it, spread that way. So, and that's how I think a lot of journalists, including us, found folks to talk to. So yes, it's there. It's something that inhibits us to a certain degree, but it's also, as Melinda said, it doesn't have, there's no right or wrong. There's no morals about it. It is what it is. It's a lot of information flying back and forth. And if you tap into those veins of information, it can be very useful. Yeah. And China's deeply, I mean, it's more tech is probably more embedded in the society there than here in the US, I would say.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, that's fine. So that's one. The other thing that I heard, I forget which of the two of you said it. I think the geopolitical and the sort of political situation, the tightening, has in some ways made particularly young people almost more interested in talking to us. In some cases, I don't know if that's your experience, but these are people that were born with more freedoms and rights and more sort of and a brighter future in a way than they have right now. And I've never felt in the mere 20 odd years that I've been doing China, which is nothing compared to Melinda and Anne, I've never felt the place so pessimistic as it is now.
Wow. Anne,
I would agree with that.
Yeah. You would.
Yeah, I think during the pandemic years, the 3 years when the pandemic was creating some very, very heavy restrictions on movement and travel and all that, people were hoping that they could get to the light at the end of the tunnel. And there was a lot of expectation that as soon as we get over this, everything will go back to normal. Happy days will be here again. It'll be like the 90s, party like the 90s. They got to the end of the tunnel and they found it was another tunnel, just slightly bigger, but this one has no light at the end of it. It's just one long tunnel. And I think that's created a lot of psychological frustration and depression. That's part of why I think there's something psychological going on. Or maybe it's just me, but anyway, definitely with me, there's a feeling of, oh my God, it's another long tunnel.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask you to respond to that, and also about how you given what you know about surveillance potential that's out there, how you keep your sources safe. But first, I just want to say to those who are watching, we're going to go to questions in about 7 minutes. So there's a Q&A box. Go ahead and put your question in, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So go ahead, Anne.
Okay, so which question did you want me to respond to?
So both what John and Melinda were just saying, that they feel that it's a more pessimistic time now than they've seen in China, and also the question that I had asked before that about, given that there are new capabilities in terms of surveillance, as well as the old school ways of doing surveillance, which still happen, like, what do you feel you need to keep in mind that perhaps was different than when you were in China the first time about keeping your sources safe?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the pessimism, I think that there are definite strains of that. I mean, I've reported on people who just felt like so trapped during the pandemic that they really had to get out. I feel that there has been a phenomenon of that. I mean, there was something called the run philosophy, which was young people, especially urban young people, wanting to leave the country, especially after the experience of like the Shanghai lockdown, which was very, very severe, which I was present in Shanghai during that. So I went through it myself. So you can certainly see people feeling a little bit trapped, a little bit traumatized. And I think young people face a number of challenges today. I mean, I know people who, their whole lives, everything has been basically getting better and better and better in China, and now they're not. And so they're facing this for the first time. And I recently, and it was May Day, which is Labor Day in China, May 1st, I went to investigate a story of young people who were flocking to this Buddhist temple in Beijing to burn incense and offer prayers in order to help their job prospects. There's more than 20% unemployment among young people today. And I found that those young people were not only very worried about finding a job, but they were sort of sick of the rat race, and they were not inclined to compete extra hard to live in big cities like Beijing and Shanghai. They were talking about things like going back to their hometowns, becoming teachers, becoming civil servants, these sort of safer jobs. Now, that's okay for them, but it's not really that great for China, because China's economy needs innovation and creativity, and not people just sort of sitting back and young people having a safer life. And, the government obviously doesn't like that. So that's on sort of the sentiment. Also in my travels through China, I mean, the economic damage of the COVID policies are just very evident. Any entrepreneur you talk to, I mean, they've just been so badly hurt. How could they not have been when you're locking down a city the size of Beijing with 23 million people, over 50 COVID cases? I mean, that was happening when I was there, and just how much was lost. In any case, on the surveillance and the monitoring that can happen, I basically feel that I always respect people's choices if they want their names used or they don't want their names used. And I feel that if there are people who want to say something, they sort of already know. Every Chinese person knows the lines that they can or cannot cross, and they make those decisions for themselves. And I respect their wishes and their decisions. And if they want to say something, then I feel like they know that, okay, they can do that. So I don't really let it get to me, the fact that Big Brother's always able to watch.
So one more quick question, and this is a lightning round before we go to audience questions. Beyond what we've already talked about, and we've already touched on this in different ways, what's something you think is important for Americans to know about China right now and the changes that are happening in China, that perhaps there's a gap in terms of understanding? And I'm just going to go around. Melinda.
Okay. What I should have said, and this follows on something that Anne mentioned, there's one area of endeavor that for me is sort of a personal hobby. I've been doing a lot of research and worked on a couple of films related to American aviators in World War II China. And I feel so happy that I have done that over these years, because it's revealed to me something that was true 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and is still true today. At the grassroots level, there is a deep reservoir of goodwill towards Americans. You know, if you were Joe Blow in America, you might not know that, or it might not, might be counterintuitive, but it is there, and it is strong, and it is still happening. Just in the past month, I've given a series of talks in Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Shenyang about a film related to this topic, and dozens of Chinese in the audience, and they were all very positive, not at all rude. I was ready to be trolled, or whatever you call trolling when it's in real life, but nothing like that happened.
John, how about you? And if I may, I mean, you've done a lot of business reporting and economic reporting in China. China's going through a very particular moment in terms of its economy. What should Americans know about that and what it means for life in China?
I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to answer a different question.
Okay.
Because what I really think is important, one of the reasons I switched to NPR is that there's the flow of news. There are the big trends we all have to cover, the economics, the visits, the human rights, all these types of things. But I got into journalism. I grew up in the Midwest. I got into journalism and studied China because I thought China was fascinating and basically didn't know anything about it. And I think most Americans don't really know much about it. And so insofar as we can be bridges to tell stories about, and this is trite, I know, tell stories about people in China, right? And have somebody sitting in St. Louis, Missouri, or Akron, Ohio, or San Francisco, or wherever, who doesn't know anything about China, think, huh, that's interesting. I can relate to that person. The geopolitics kind of are out of my head right now, but that's an interesting person. I think that's an important role.
Okay. And Anne?
I agree about the reservoir of goodwill. When I recently went to northern Shanxi province, I was reminded, I went to look into an organization an American organization that had been building schools there, a few decades ago. And there is still a tremendous, China really is a nation of haves and have-nots. There are, more than half of the population is living on a very, very meager income. They need help. They want development, and they do remember what Americans did in their areas. And unfortunately, many of those projects are not ongoing anymore. But I would simply say that Chinese, again and again, ordinary people will come up to me and finding out I'm American, and they'll say, we don't want war. We don't want a conflict. We want peace. And that is a message that just people will literally come up to me and say that. So when you think of the struggles, the day-to-day struggles that many people in China are dealing with, you realize how devastating that would be. And I would simply add that I think in both countries, there's a potential for a lot of misperception at a time when, the Chinese media about the United States is uniformly negative, the official media reporting. And then a lot of the reporting on China in the US is also pretty negative. And so it's good to just, I agree with John, get out there, talk about, understand what is going on in Chinese people's lives and relate that for the American reader.
Great. Thank you all. Now, going to questions from the audience, one question actually does bring in geopolitics. Do you feel pressured from your HQ to report about China in a manner that satisfies the current political preferences in terms of the geopolitical tendencies of your respective organization? This is already happening in domestic journalism due to economic pressure of media organizations, with social media encroaching on the traditional means of getting information. Does anyone feel that they're under pressure to report through a particular lens?
No. I do not. And if anything, I feel the more there's sort of a particular lens that everybody else is covering China through, the more interesting our conversations are with other reporters and with editors involved in covering China about ways to interrogate those lines of reporting.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in, or? Okay. Go ahead, Melinda.
I think we always feel pressure. I will only speak for myself. I always feel pressure, including from myself, to write something that other people want to read. To me, that's one of the first hurdles. So the question then becomes, are people looking only to read negative news, or are they interested in something more balanced, something that has a positive angle? And I think it's very hard to make a generalization. I think people like stuff they haven't read before, or stuff they didn't know before, they hadn't heard before. And so, for me, the challenge is really, finding out people that I didn't know before who are saying something that I hadn't heard before, and hoping that it'll interest somebody out there.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that, as a career journalist, that, I think a good journalist is often a contrarian, and who thinks not trying to go against something for the sake of it, but more to report against yourself, to think, what am I not thinking of? what other angles should I be considering? Everyone's being so positive about China. It's, at the time of the Olympics, what else is part of the picture that needs to be there? Everyone's being so negative about China, but there are these other things going on, and it's important to also pay attention to this. So at this particular moment, when there have been, an unusually large amount of tensions between the US and China, one of the questions here is about Taiwan, and asking whether, with people you've talked to in mainland China about Taiwan, have you noticed a change in what the Chinese people you're talking to are saying about the US-China relationship, but also about Taiwan and what they feel needs to happen there? John, I think you've done some reporting on Taiwan recently. How about you?
I can't say I've noticed a major change, to be honest with you. I think it feels like in general, folks in China believe that Taiwan is part of China and should be part of the People's Republic of China, and that the US is interfering. And I can remember hearing people say those types of things over the years. So I don't think it's really changed.
Okay.
Has it? What do you guys think?
That's also been my experience. I haven't talked to a lot of ordinary people about Taiwan lately on the mainland, but I have talked to a few scholars about that, and it was exactly that. Basically, the U.S. needs to not interfere. If the U.S. weren't interfering and supporting Taiwan, Taiwan would have peacefully become part of the mainland like a long time ago. And so again, that's sort of from the academic scholar standpoint. But again, what I have heard from ordinary people is we don't want a war.
So here's another question. Sorry, go ahead, Melinda. Sorry.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is I haven't spoken to anyone who I think was being genuine, saying, bring it on. We want this war with Taiwan over Taiwan, and we'll take Taiwan. I've never heard that sort of thing, even if the government rhetoric might be a bit more aggressive. I think I actually lived in Taiwan in the 70s, before the lifting of martial law, and a lot of the hardline government tactics targeting foreign correspondents I had already experienced in the 70s in Taiwan. What's a little bit different is I think a lot of people now, ordinary people in mainland China, they actually know. They don't know too much about Taiwan. I think maybe before they just assumed it's probably a little bit like Fujian, speak a weird dialect and eat a lot of seafood. But now they actually know that there's something different going on, some politics that they have no idea about and probably have no interest in. And so they don't say too much different, except I think deep down they know a war over Taiwan would be a total disaster for China and Chinese people. So I don't sense any eagerness for that whatsoever.
Yeah, I will say I actually did hear from some more nationalistic young Chinese men, maybe back in 2011, 2012, 2013, like kind of, we'll do whatever it takes. And I didn't hear them volunteering to join the army, but like in a bar over a beer, they were certainly willing to talk about it as though they would put their life on the line. Here's another question. So given that people-to-people exchange has taken such a hit, the glimpse into Chinese society that all of you and your colleagues offer to the public is super important. In terms of maintaining the reservoirs of goodwill that most of you said have been built over the years, what do you feel is important for the average American to know and keep in mind? We've already talked about that a little. Is there something you haven't said that you think you'd want to add to the conversation?
Well, I would add one point. These days, a lot of people say, "Oh, why are you going to China? Like, aren't you afraid to go to China?" I think that people are very nervous about going to China, and I would say that I believe, I mean, this is because there have been high profile cases of hostage diplomacy, and, they're coming out with counter-espionage laws and all of these sorts of rules. But I would say that China is now open for tourist visas, as I understand it. And I would say there are warnings. There are things you should be familiar with before you go. And I suppose that there could be greater risks than in the past. But I think that if people have an interest in China and want to explore it more for themselves, that they should go and they should interact with Chinese and not be, I wouldn't necessarily be afraid to do that.
Okay. Another question, given that Chinese websites and other online information sources are increasingly blocked from overseas, are foreign journalists in China facing similar blockages? In other words, are you facing similar blockages? And how do you get around them if you are?
This is a question about being in China and trying to get foreign websites?
Yes. What's the current state of the art? Without going into the detail that would give away.
Sometimes it's VPN whack-a-mole. You have to try different VPNs to see which one works. And the rhythm that you talked about earlier about tightening and loosening around political events, around sensitive times, that still happens, and it happens with VPNs.
But generally, you can get what you need with the whack-a-mole approach?
Yep, for the most part.
I think journalists can, but of course, some of the best VPNs are not free. So what I think the effect is more felt at the everyday level. Basically, the internet is becoming a fragmented universe, not the one big happy family that we thought at the turn of the 2000s. Most Chinese do not have VPNs. And even many expats in China who are not journalists, of course, diplomats are in a different category altogether. They have their own communications. But a lot of expats I know, either they don't have VPNs or they kind of think it's a hassle to use them. And so they are somewhat cut off. And I've got to say, it's a bit of a hassle. When you use a VPN, you can generally access overseas websites, but there are some apps and websites inside China you cannot access if you're using. So you got to constantly toggle back and forth and lose your train, and it's a logistic hassle. And I think that fragmentation is continuing. And of course, there are some people who don't even use email anymore. They're all doing everything on their phone through apps, and what they're seeing is what they're choosing to see. So they're an overseas website is the last thing on their minds, usually.
Yeah. I remember talking to a college student back, this is, a decade ago, who said, basically, I have plenty to look at, on the web here. If the government doesn't want me to see something, there's probably a good reason for it. I don't know that that's a universal feeling, but there are only somewhere between a million, 2 million Chinese who are using VPNs. That used to be the statistic. It was pretty low given how many people might use them. Partly also because it draws attention to yourself. Why are you trying to not be seen in terms of what you're doing online? It makes you potentially suspect. Here's a basic question. Someone wondering if you're all proficient in Mandarin, and if so, could you share your journey and how long it took you to achieve fluency? I believe you are all fluent. Do you want to speak briefly on this?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk briefly. I studied Mandarin in college for just a year. Then I had a scholarship to study it in Hong Kong for another year at Chinese University. And then I went to China and I had a tutor and kept on just studying it on my own. Every time I write an article, I would develop new vocabulary. And I'm capable of, when I travel, I travel by myself. I don't take an interpreter. And that has the advantage of every single person who I encounter. they have to deal with me. They can't turn to someone else. They have to. So I pick up a lot of things that way, and it's I mean, I think Chinese is not that difficult a language. People have difficulty with the tones sometimes, but it's very mathematical, the grammar. The grammar is simpler than English. It's certainly simpler than a language like Japanese. And Chinese will very much appreciate any effort you make to speak Chinese with them. This is always just when they find out that I could speak Chinese, I mean, that they're super happy about that.
John?
Yeah, similar. I studied Mandarin in college, and then studied in Taipei after college, and then began working in Chinese-speaking environments. And fluency, it's hard to define. I feel like I'm still learning every day, and grammatically it might be a pretty straightforward language, but I feel like the vocabulary is particularly challenging. If you're interviewing somebody on a subject you've never touched before, you really have to look up the words. You're never going to be able to fake your way through it.
Yeah, and Melinda?
Yeah, well, I was born in the States and educated there. So for me, Chinese is my second language, and it's never good enough. I'm constantly in despair that I run into people who I can't understand. In places like, Dongbei or someplace like that, or Wenzhou, it's a use it or lose it situation. I think there were some times during the pandemic when I was like literally not seeing too many people, not going to many places, and not actually communicating in Chinese with a lot of different people. And I think my Chinese went backwards. Certainly my reading levels, were that needs constant improvement. Speaking for myself, there is no there is no set answer to how long does it take to become fluent. I think if you did a total immersion situation, it can happen relatively quickly. If you watch a lot of Chinese television or whatever, or if your spouse happens to be Chinese, you can pick it up pretty quickly. What's difficult for most Americans are the tones. And of course, there are a number of tonal languages in the world, not just Mandarin. But if you've grown up all your life not even thinking about tones, and suddenly you're confronted with the need to know them, it can be a challenge.
Yeah. And at the moment, there are fewer Americans studying in China than had been before, and far fewer Americans studying in China than Chinese studying in America. So for the future generation or generations of China correspondents, American China correspondents, there's a lot of room in the schools to learn Chinese and learn your way into China. Melinda, John, Anne, thank you so much for this really engaging, rich conversation. I've enjoyed it, and I'm grateful to you all. And over to you, Margaret.
Thank you to you as well, Mary Kay, and again to all of our speakers, Melinda, Anne, and John. That was a fascinating behind-the-scenes conversation, and that report at the top on fair game from Mary Kay was really insightful. Thank you all for sharing. If you're not already an Asia Society member, please join us. You're going to get access to a number of terrific events. We have events coming up in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Seattle. On September 12th, we're going to celebrate the launch of our Seattle Center. Our former Asia Society CEO and Australia's ambassador to the US, Kevin Rudd, Danny Russell, and more are going to be there. This is the 16th center that Asia Society is launching worldwide. Japan Capitalism at Work, that's going to be on September 15th in San Francisco. Our Seattle members will have virtual access. This program is a unique take on Japan's economy with speakers that are traveling in from Japan. The head of the Asian Development Bank, Chantal Wong, will be with us in person from the Philippines on September 18th in San Francisco. We're doing an event on the Silicon Triangle, the US, Taiwan, China, and semiconductors. That's on September 26th in Silicon Valley. And we're going to talk about global trade with a focus on India with Arun Kumar on October 10th in Silicon Valley. Remember that APEC leaders and CEO summits will be hosted in San Francisco in mid-November, so stay tuned for all of our events and save the date for the culmination of our Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S.-China Series conference on U.S.-China on January 18th in Silicon Valley. Thank you to our Asia Society team, Nina, Christy, Jason, Mon, Aaron, and our interns. We are deeply grateful again to all of our speakers. Thank you so, so much. And on behalf of Asia Society Northern California and Seattle, thank you all for joining us.